all for coming out on this cold night, but for Chicagoans, we can handle it. This is a very special event for us here tonight. It's not a part of any big series, but I'm going to call it the Staff's Choice Lecture. I wanted to hear that. So I'm glad you want to hear her as much as I do. I'm Tracy Matthews. I'm the Associate Director here at the Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture. And I'd like to thank our co-sponsors, the Center for the Study of Gender and Sexuality, and also the Seminary Co-op Bookstore. We hope that if you don't already have your copy, you'll stop and pick up a copy of Professor Ford's book before you leave. And I especially want to thank Dara Epperson, who did all the heavy lifting to pull this program together. So let's give her a hand. She's trying to stand up. Thank her for ordering some extra delicious food for us tonight. Okay, Dr. Tanisha Ford is an assistant professor of women, gender, and sexuality studies at UMass Amherst, and she's the author of Liberated Threads, Black Women's Style, and the Global Politics of Soul. Yay, a highly anticipated book, and she's a rising star, and I'm so excited that she wanted to come spend some time with us here. She has current and forthcoming publications in the Journal of Southern History, the Journal of Contemporary African Art, and the Black Scholar, and her research has been supported by the Ford Foundation, the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, and the Center for Black Music Research. Her public writing and cultural commentary have been featured in diverse media outlets and publications, including The Root, The New Yorker, NPR Code Switch, Fuse, News One, The Feminist Wire, and Feministing. And tonight she's going to be speaking about dressing for the revolution, the politics of style, from Black power to Black Lives Matter. Please join me in welcoming Professor Tanisha Ford.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Matthews, for that wonderful intro. Let me just tell you, it means a lot to hear Tracy Matthews say she wants to hear from me because it was your work on Black women and Black power that really kind of set the trajectory for so much of what has come since. And so I feel like this work is really indebted to you and your contributions to the fellowship. So thank you for your warm introduction. Yes, right? Yes. Celebrate our own. And I'd also like to thank the Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture, and the Center for the Study of Gender and Sexuality, and Seminary Co-op for inviting me here. Again, special thank you to Dara Epperson for taking such good care of me. We had a blizzard in New York, and so it really affected my travel, and so Dara was very flexible in working with me to make sure I got here. I got here in one piece, and I was safe, and so I appreciate that. And again, thank you to all of you for coming out, for being a wonderful audience. I know there's a lot of competition. Is Scandal back on yet? No? Okay, so I'm good. Later tonight, it is back on. Okay, so I'll be brief then. I know we have things to do. So I want to thank you all for coming out and spending some time with me. I hope that the material I put on the table will be engaging, and we can have an interesting conversation afterwards, and then hopefully I can join you with the food and libations. So yes, what I want to do tonight is really unpack some of this stuff related to dress and style and politics, right? How do these things intersect? And so to start, I want to begin by sharing something I saw this summer. A few days after my birthday, actually, I was watching Melissa Harris Perry's show, and she had Tef Poe, who is a rapper, an activist, poet, who's based in St. Louis. And she's talking to him and another panel of guests, but she's interviewing him. He's on location somewhere. And so she says to him, Tef Poe, you have a shirt on that says, "This ain't your mama's civil rights movement, is that right?" And he says, "Yes, it is." And so she says, just again, we have about 20 seconds. Tell me how this movement is different. And then he says, I mean, it walks different. I mean, I'm on national TV with a bunch of tattoos on my hands and my ball cap on backwards, right? So for most people, this probably would have been a statement that didn't really matter much. You would have heard it and you would have glossed right over it. But for me, it was like, aha, that's exactly what I study. And these are the exact reasons why, okay? There are many ways that one could compare the civil rights movement of the 1960s with Black Lives Matter movement today. You could talk about political strategies, you could talk about organizational strategies. Where are certain types of organizing and protest, where is it occurring? But the first thing that he says in this 20-second bit that he has to speak his piece, he says that the movement walks different, right? That the way I'm dressed looks different than that of the 1960s movement. And that was an important piece to say this. There's an embodied activism that we are engaging that looks differently than the civil rights movement era. So I wanted to take that. Here's a screenshot that I was able to find on the internet. You can't see the whole shirt, but it just says, "This ain't your mama's civil rights movement" down the front. And I wanted to take that and really think about this idea of dressing for the revolution, of this embodied sense of activism. We are used to now seeing the Asada Taught Me sweatshirts that were created by another St. Louis-based activist, Ashley Brown Blaze Yates, one that centers Black women, Asada Shakur, as a leader, a political leader, as a leader of intellectual thought, one that teaches us how to engage in revolutionary politics, with the hoodie and the t-shirt being a marker of that. Here are members of the Trans Women of Color Collective based in New York City, who too are dressed for the revolution, especially considering how Laverne Cox has taught us that being a trans woman, particularly a trans woman of color, in the wrong neighborhood wearing a miniskirt could get you arrested, because the police might think that you're a sex worker. They'll automatically assume that. They'll criminalize your body just based on what you're wearing. Or you're subject to attacks from transphobic and trans-misogynistic vigilantes, just based on what you're wearing. So here are the women of Tiwak dressed for the revolution. Another image that we're now accustomed to seeing, the big Black Lives Matter banner. You can see a wide array of people who are dressed in hoodies and t-shirts with Black Power fists on the front. Here's one from my own collection of the images. This is me at the Millions March in New York City wearing my sorority letters. This is at a time when several Black sororities were discouraging their organizations from wearing their letters to marches and protests. So many of us in these Greek letter organizations decide to wear our letters as an act of defiance, really. To say that Black Greek letter organizations really do have a role to play. We should be amplifying our voices in the movement. So here I am marching alongside the Sister Circle Collective and Girls for Gender Equity in New York City. And then there's this image from the Super Bowl. Beyonce and her dancers dressed in what many have characterized as a tribute to the Black Panther Party. They are wearing afros, I would say afro wigs or some type of hairpiece that might not be all of their hair. And I point that out for a reason. I'm going to come back to that. But they have the clenched fist. You know, they're wearing this attire that has some people asking, are they dressed for the revolution? Right, so we can take up that question. But what I wanted to do tonight was then take all of these images that we see now that are commonplace, that represent the movement that we are living through right now, and I want to put them in conversation with some of the work that I've done on the past. And so what I'm not going to do is do a decade by decade breakdown of Black style politics. I'm sorry if that's disappointing for people who really wanted to talk about shell-toe Adidas and fat laces in the 80s. We can talk about that. We can wax nostalgic about that moment during the Q&A. But what I really want to do is talk about the political and style antecedents to Black Lives Matter. By grounding my discussion tonight in the work that I've done for my first book, Liberated Threads, Black Women, Style, and the Global Politics of Soul, which was published in October of 2015. So with this, what I want to do is take seriously Tef Poe's assertion that this movement walks around differently. And in order to do that, what I want to do is both walk you through some of the evidence I found while I was working on Liberated Threads, and also then tell you how I compile that evidence and how I analyzed it in order to tell a new history of the civil rights movement that allows us to think critically about how the civil rights movement era might walk around differently than Black Lives Matter, but also how we have studied and discussed that movement is also problematic. And if we shift the lens on how we study and analyze that movement, maybe we can see some more similar threads that link that earlier time period to the present. So as I worked on this book, in order to do that very work, I had to assemble what I call an eclectic archive of materials that I was finding as I traveled across the United States, but also abroad to places like London and Johannesburg and Cape Town, South Africa. And so my eclectic archive it comprises objects like obscure magazines and broadsides, album covers, passports, yearbooks, FBI files, and so forth. And I started interviewing fashion and jewelry designers, models, and college students like my mother who came of age in the 1970s, using those interviews to flesh out the materials I was finding in the archive. So what my goal was here then was to tell a new history of the civil rights and Black Power movement era by bridging two bodies of literature that often aren't thought of side by side. And one is the body of literature on fashion studies and fashion theory, which is often about material culture, clothing as objects, but is often removed from bodies. And when we start talking about fashion, that can be problematic because a lot of the people who are innovating the very garments that we're talking about are people from marginalized communities that the fashion industry comes in and takes those styles and then mass markets. But then there's also this body of movement history that I'm engaging that does deal with bodies, but thinks about how bodies function as blockades, right? As bodies that transgress the Jim Crow line, particularly in the U.S. South. And so I wanted to put those two bodies of literature together to think about the importance of embodied activism, right? Or what the body is communicating about freedom, what freedom looks like, how Black folks are envisioning freedom through what they're wearing. To me, this was an important part of the movement because not everyone was involved in formal political organizing, but a lot of folks could engage in style. You know, they knew what they wanted their bodies to look like. They knew the kind of pleasure they took in what they wore every day. And that for a lot of people was political. The act of getting dressed every day was a political act. And so I wanted to take that question seriously. What can the everyday practice of getting dressed teach us about the global Black freedom struggle? So let me just start by showing you some of the things I came across. So here's an image from the March on Washington. And I think that this is the very kind of image that Tefpo is talking about when he says that our movement walks around different, right? This is a very iconic image from the March on Washington, August 1963. If you look here, let's point out some things you see in this image. Like, what are the women wearing?
Pearls.
Right, right, pearls. Like, you see that front and center. Okay, so they're wearing pearls. What else?
Dresses.
Dresses.
High heels.
Right, high heels. Someone says Sunday's best. Great. What about the men here? What do you see?
Suits, ties.
Suits and ties. Right, so that you see it's a pretty clear gender distinction, right? Women are marking their womanhood through the display of wearing dresses and skirts and pearls and modesty heel pumps. Men are very much dressed in suits and ties and pants. And this attire was known as the Sunday best, right? You're going to wear that Sunday's best attire, and we're going to use respectability as a strategy, right? If we dress in our Sunday's best, and we then sit in at a lunch counter, and white segregationists then attack us, then we're exposing the savagery of segregation and segregationists, right? While showing that we are civil and we are polished and refined, and we therefore deserve our full rights. Okay, so this was a strategy that many were invested in using in the early 1960s, and images like this become the symbol or emblematic of that movement. But then I found this image, this is also from the March on Washington, but it's one that doesn't quite circulate in the same way as that other right? But when I looked at it, I was like, huh, okay, something completely different is happening in this picture. And it's an image of two members of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. They're sisters, Dory and Joyce Ladner. They were students at Tugulu College, and they were field secretaries for SNCC, which meant it was their job to go around and coordinate voter registration drives and whatever other actions that SNCC was coordinating in the Deep South. So they come to the March on Washington, and this is what they're wearing. As you can see, it looks far different than the Sunday best. It's like a bib and brace overall with a worker style shirt or a Peter Pan collared shirt that was common in school attire, like for student uniforms. And Anne Moody actually remarks on this moment in her memoir when she writes and says that the SNCC freedom singers were invited up on stage at the March on Washington to sing some songs, and she said she was really nervous to go on stage, and she said it wasn't just because she was afraid to sing in front of a crowd, but it was because she looked around and realized that she was, quote, the only girl from Mississippi with a dress on. All the others were wearing denim skirts and jeans. Right? So she notices, like, wait a minute, there's been a shift in the style of dress that marks our movement, that marks our politics. Okay, so what I wanted to do then was figure out, well, what led to this shift? And what was this about? And why don't we hear about this narrative when we learn about the Civil Rights Movement? Because perhaps if we had, then we would have a more fully fleshed and fully formed image of what that movement was, what the strategies were, that respectability was not the sole political language of the day, that there were other forms of activism that were taking place that were more radical in their nature, both in terms of the political strategies, but also in terms of the embodied activism. Okay, so what I then did was I scoured other memoirs that I had read millions of times before, like Anne Moody's, and I started to see what other people were talking about this dress thing. What other folks was talking about their hair? Because if you can see, Joyce Ladner's hair is very short, closely cropped, it's natural. That looks far different than the press and curl look from the previous image, right? So I found mentions of this in memoirs, and what I was able to conclude was that a lot of women were foregoing getting their hair pressed because it wasn't practical to press their hair every day when they were on the front lines of the movement, getting sprayed by water hoses, attacked by police dogs, when they're having long stints in jail and the humidity in the southern jails is causing their hair to kink back up and revert, right, to that natural state. A lot of them didn't have knowledge of local beauty salons. They didn't have the money to. So to be clear, I mean, there were women like Dory Ladner who never went with their hair natural. They managed to keep pressing and curling each other's hair and things like that. But there are a lot of women who did, who said, wait, this is just too much. For others, it became a way to emulate some of their favorite singers and entertainers who were also going natural, many for political reasons. So Joyce Ladner tells me that she was emulating Abby Lincoln, for example, who was one of her role models. At the same time, Odetta, the folk singer, was popularizing this hairstyle to the point where a lot of people called it the Odetta. Okay, so you have that layer. And then with the dress, people were realizing similar things with the Sunday best attire. Where are we going to wash our clothes? Like, are we going to wash our clothes every day? We can take out the denims and we can kind of dust them off and put them on, and hey, they look clean, you know, even if we haven't had a chance to wash them, right? People say that they wore them for very practical reasons. These were things that had a lot of pockets where they could hide pins and brochures and other goodies in the pockets. But then there was also something else that came to the surface as I started to interview women in SNCC. And they said we were doing it because we wanted to align ourselves with the sharecroppers we were organizing alongside. Okay? That this was a way for us to consciously critique a bourgeois, middle-class respectability politics, middle-class aspirations, that even though a lot of these students had come from working-class backgrounds, now they were at universities like Tugulu, like Howard, like Spelman, like Morehouse, And they were learning how they were supposed to ascend into that black middle class. And a lot of them were challenging that. They were challenging the politics of the national NAACP that looked at the Southern sharecroppers as backwards, right? Who looked like, well, we're giving you the national mandate. We're telling you what movement organizing should look like. And a lot of these folks are saying, hey, but we know this terrain. We know the politics down here, you don't. And so one of the women I interviewed, Judy Richardson, told me that the local NAACP members preferred that they didn't come in wearing the suit and tie of, the national NAACP, and that was a way to form this political alliance. So SNCC was really invested in a type of organizing that united people across class. Okay, and that the denim overall became a uniform of sorts. I call it their SNCC skin, right? That the clothing becomes another layer of skin, that if we can dress all in the same style or in a similar style, there's a way that we can then transcend the boundaries of race. We can break the shackles of racism. We can rethink class alliances. We can challenge class constructions. And I say that this was really central to their revolutionary politics, that they were really starting to define in as we move towards the middle of the 1960s. And so these women, for me, were really instrumental in that. Now I started to find more about who was involved and what this movement looked like as I found the FBI file on SNCC. Right now, a lot of it was still redacted, so there were certain details I couldn't find, but in short, what I found was that in the early years, the FBI claims that it was only surveilling SNCC because it was looking for members of the Communist Party who were trying to infiltrate SNCC and ruin these good Southern Christian kids who just wanted to organize, right? They wanted to sing their good peaceful songs, but then you have those angry people from the Communist Party who wanted to infiltrate, right? So this is what they claim in this FBI file. And one of the women that they're following is Debbie Amos Bell, who is the daughter of two members of the Communist Party who live in Philadelphia. She's a college student at a university in Pennsylvania, and she leaves to become a field secretary for SNCC in Atlanta. And so the FBI is all up in her business. I mean, they're following her. She was at this march. She was at this protest. So I'm able to track her down through the FBI file. And then I was a part of a SNCC listserv. And so I found her email address, and I said, hey, I would really like to interview you for this. It was a dissertation at the time. I would interview you for my dissertation. And she agrees, and then we talk, and she says, well, how did you find me? I was like, oh, you're all over the FBI file. And she's like, am I really? And I'm like, yes. Wow. So we have this interesting conversation where she, too, talks about the denim overalls and the natural hair. And she tells me these stories about how they then start having their parents ship them denim garments so that they can have at least one pair of denim, either a skirt or pants or a bib and brace overall that they could wear to be a part of the organization. Judy Richardson is another woman who tells me by the time I joined SNCC, like shortly after the March on Washington, that this was already pretty much standard. That when you came down, you were kind of baptized into the SNCC way. You became part of the beloved community, and part of the way that happened was then you started to dress down. And denim was one of the ways you did that. And that women already knew at that point, that we don't, quote unquote, fry our hair anymore. We were in our hair natural. And that even the white women in the organization knew that was the fact and was telling other folks, they're like, oh no, you can't wear your hair straight anymore, right? So there's this whole conversation amongst the people about what this revolutionary dress looks like, what politics it symbolizes. And so what I'm not saying here was that they were now this monolith, but what I'm saying is there starts to be a shift. A shift starts to occur, right, where more and more people are starting to wear forms of casual attire, denim being one of them, And this coincides with a movement on campus, on particularly HBCUs across the South, where Black students, both men and women, are saying, yeah, we don't want to be all buttoned up in this more formal attire, not just of the movement, that was just the dress of the day, right? People were dressed, they dressed up more so than we do today. And these college students were really also pushing back against campus dress codes. And a lot of the people doing this were the women. Because at places like Spelman, you could not go without wearing stockings. You had to wear dresses or skirts. I gave this talk, or a similar form of this talk last week, and a woman who was one of my former professors, who was a student at Spelman at the time, said she got a list before she came to campus of all the things she needed to bring with her. One of them was a girdle. You had to have a skirts and dresses and stockings and all that. There was like a list of like, this is how a Spelman woman looks, right? So women were saying, wait a minute, no. Some of them were involved in the movement, other people were. We just don't want to dress like this anymore, okay? And this is a part of a trend that's taking place across college campuses. Both in the North and the South, predominantly white, historically Black, where students are saying, we don't want to be restricted by your dress code, we don't want to be restricted by your curfews. They're pushing back against this idea that campus administrators have the right to function as their parents and lord over them in this way. And so a lot of these students, even if they weren't active in the civil rights struggle, a lot of them are cutting their teeth as activists by challenging these dress codes on campus. Okay, so places like Spelman, as Howard Zinn said, that were once dormant, quiet, and never looking like a movement would happen here, bam, within the space of a couple years, everybody's out protesting in some way, shape, or form, even if it's just through this embodied practice of challenging the dress codes. So again, when we start to shift our focus from lunch counters and bus terminals to think more expansively about how this movement walks around, then we can have a different telling of the civil rights story. This one that is not just about big movement events like the March on Washington, where this performance of respectability through the Sunday best seems to be central. Another thing that's going on, I talked about how SNCC is transgressing these ideas of class separation and racial separation. But then there's also this gender piece that I think this picture signifies. Now, when we looked at the first picture from the March on Washington, again, we remarked at how the women are wearing dresses and skirts and the men are in pants, and so there seems to be this way that they're performing a normativity through their gender presentation, through their dress. But here, if you look at these two pictures of SNCC leaders, Joyce Ladner and Bob Moses, that distinction isn't as clear. Okay, they're both wearing bib and brace overalls. They're both wearing a worker shirt. They both have short hair. But I would argue we can't just look at it and say her hair is short and so she's transgressing notions of femininity, you know. We can also look, he's growing his hair out, right? See, so men are no longer wearing this closely shorn haircut either. It becomes a little bit more androgynous, right? What is happening here, okay? And when I saw this, I then came across a piece that was written by Casey Hayden, and she says that we were really trying to fight to become organizers. We were invested in using the language of organizer because it was gender neutral. We wanted to break down the barriers between what a man's role and a woman's role was in the movement. And that was part of our political strategy. And so again, it's not that every woman in SNCC looked like Joyce Ladner, but a lot of them did. And a lot of them did consciously. And a lot of the men do start to grow their hair out. Okay, and so this for me is an important shift. So by the time we get to the Black Power movement era, look how long these men's hair is, right? Like their hair is long. So the afro becomes this hairstyle that both neutralizes gender as much as it does say something about Black pride and Black power, right? So there's a way that even as police are starting to assault members or just black folk in general who they think are part of you're one of the agitators, you're one of those Panthers, or you're one of these other black revolutionaries. They're stopping anybody with an afro. It doesn't matter. Like when Angela Davis was fleeing from the FBI, she says that women were coming up to her and telling her that, oh, they pulled me over thinking that I was you and I was happy to be your decoy. But it wasn't just women. They were pulling men over too. They would see an afro in a car and be like, that could be her, right? They're pulling them over, okay? So I think that that's an important part of this history too. Again, another part that has ties to an earlier moment. We know that a lot of the Black Panthers' imagery and symbols come from the Southern struggle. The Black Panther itself, right? But the fact that they're wearing the leather jackets and the powder blue shirts and the, you know, all that militarized style, SNCC too had a paramilitary look as well, but it was just a denim overalls, right? But by this time period, the fight for a casual style that a lot of the earlier college students were fighting for has now become more of the norm. Deidre Clemente has an interesting book about this. It's called like, you know, Dress Casual or something. It's all about style on campuses. And she says that college students were so forceful and so effective in the way they're pushing back against these campus dress codes that by the mid-1960s, the fashion industry has even responded and is creating more casual attire. Okay, so what I argue in the larger book is that this soul style, which was once just, you know, really relegated to smaller pockets of political communities, now becomes more widely accessible to people. In part because casual is now cool, is now dressy. But it wasn't always the case, and so I think it's important to think about that historical shift. But then I want to pivot away from these more iconic images of the Panthers to think about other things that are taking place at the same time that really help us to center ourselves on college campuses where a lot of this activism is taking place. And so this is an image from Indiana University Bloomington in 1972 in Indiana, which is not too far from here. It's actually where I went to college. And this is actually my mother on the left, the right. Yes. Here. So that's my mother. This picture is taken in her dorm room. Are there things that you notice? Like if you do a close reading of this photo, what do you see?
Beaded curtains.
Right? Exactly. So we have the beads that are hanging from the top of the dorm ceiling. What else?
Is that a
But she's wearing an afro, of course.
Yes.
okay?
Can you see who it is?
No.
Can anybody see who it is?
No.
It's Angela Davis.
What?
I see
She's right here.
Yeah.
Oh,
Here's an Angela Davis poster.
Oh,
And then you really can't see this one, but right here, there's like a manila piece of paper that's a drawing of Angela Davis. And it's one that my aunt, who was my mother's best friend, so my dad's sister, my mom married her best friend's brother, okay, right? So, my aunt drew this picture for my mom before she went off to college. So she has this handmade or homemade drawing of Angela Davis here. What else? Other things you see? Afros, right? Now, okay, no shade, but this one looks like an Afro wig, right? And I'm saying this because we talked about Beyonce and her dancers, how I think that they, you know, all to make that uniform look. I don't think that that's all of their real hair. But I'm also going to tie this into a moment here. And then my mother, I mean, because I know her, I know that is all her hair. Okay, so we have this big halo afro. So the short, more closely cropped style of the early 60s then evolves into the freedom fro. And Angela Davis, in many ways, becomes the style icon of that, even though she's not trying to be. You know, magazines are like, oh, she's so glamorous with her freedom fro, right? So this becomes a popular hairstyle. But she also is a political shero for a lot of these women who are going off to predominantly white institutions, right? She is the embodiment of the soul sister, of the revolutionary thinker, of the activist, the radical activist. Also, my mom makes this bedspread that she designs in the colors of the Pan-African Unity flag, right? So this all black everything on this side of the room, right? And then on the other side of the room, she shares it with a white woman. It looks more like a typical college room, student's room from Indiana, right? But she says that in this space, it became really important for her to claim a space as a black woman. That from her predominantly black high school, believe it or not, in Fort Wayne, Indiana, where I'm from, she's from Cleveland, but went to school in Fort Wayne, was predominantly black. You go to this predominantly white institution, and your whole social reality changes.
Wow.
And you're the only black woman on your floor in your dorm.
Oh my God.
Activities are not designed for you. So she is then part of a community of women who are having conversations about what it feels like to be a black woman on a predominantly white campus, and they're having these conversations in publications like Essence magazine. So this is one of Essence's back to college issues. And the first one comes out around 1972, 1973, around the time my mom was going off to college. But this coincides with a moment where African Americans' enrollment in both mainstream and historically black institutions increases between the years of 1968 and 1972, so peak Black Power movement years, peak, women's rights movements, gay rights movement years. These numbers increase from roughly 400,000 to more than 700,000, with the bulk of these students attending predominantly white institutions. Okay, so the fight for civil rights, the fight for black studies on campus, the fight to make spaces for black students at predominantly white institutions helps us get these numbers, but then the schools don't have anything in place to support the students once they get there, right? They're still trying to hire black faculty, to teach the classes, to be administrators. So Essence is discussing these things. It has black women students writing in and talking about what it feels like to be the only black person in your class. What it feels like to not be welcome to the kind of social activities you were once easily a part of in your high schools, like cheerleading squads and drill teams, pageants and fashion shows. So they write about this. One of the pieces a woman talks about, some students are able to kind of cross those racial lines and find a community in these spaces, but many can't. And the university is not very sympathetic to this, and oftentimes these women write about what it's like to try to congregate with other black students, and the administrators automatically think it's because you're immature and you're not prepared or ready to be in college. That's why you need to cling to people who look like you, right? In the case of Indiana, where my mother goes to school, in 1968, a black woman is killed by members of the KKK. She was I think she sold like encyclopedias, and she was killed while she was on her route, and that murder went unsolved until recently. Like, I think when I was in graduate school at Indiana, like, they finally solved that murder and figured out who this man was who murdered her, because his daughter, who was actually in the car when it happened, had remembered that this thing had happened and her father was the perpetrator. But think about that. We talk about Klan country, but think about the fear and sheer terror that women are leaving their homes and they're going to a campus like Indiana, where you have to drive right through Martinsville, which was considered like the heart of KKK activism in southern Indiana, to get to Bloomington. The KKK has permission to march through the town of Bloomington, but if you're congregating, then campus police might arrest you because they might think you plotting and planning something, right? So these are real experiences that are also being recorded in the IU yearbook, the Argus. So I use the yearbook as a primary source material, where black women are talking about what it's like to try to go to a school dance, and they ain't playing any music you want to hear, and nobody wants to dance with you, right? So these, again, are real experiences. But alongside those more serious pieces, Essence has these fashion spreads, where they're telling what they're calling them black co-eds, how to dress. Like, these are the hot new fashions, right? And so to the point where one of the pieces, each one centers on a different HBCU. So I think the first one is on the Atlanta University Center and all the colleges and universities that are part of that center. And then another one, I think, is at Morris Brown, and the fashion spread is called Fall In Fly. right? So when you step on the yard, in the fall, like this is what you need to be wearing. And it's telling women that like basically that dressy look is out. That what you need to be doing is maybe have like one nice piece, one fur or something, some fancy jewelry, but go to a thrift store, find some denim, find some other prints and materials, and kind of throw a look together, that mixes the high and the low. Okay, so women like my mother, there's a great image in the book that, I don't know why I don't have it on these slides, but my mom, she sewed her own clothes. So if you were one of these black women on campus who could sew your own clothes, you were like a fashionista, honey. Like you were like the diva of the yard, you coming through, So my mom has this picture of her with like a zebra print gele with a matching zebra print maxi dress. Oh. Yes, and all her full-length zebra glory, okay? This was her way of imagining or embodying what Africa looked like to her, right? Having never gone, only seen pictures, only imagining what it would look like, right? And so women who could pull off these looks, again, they were like the style divas of the yard. But Essence is trying to tell you, well, if you can't get that, or if you don't live in a big city where there's like boutiques that can sell some of these wares, you can buy a little piece of fabric from Joanne Fabric or somewhere. That's where my mom used to get her fabric. You can buy a little piece of fabric, and you can get a little beret, or you can get some elephant hair earrings and some cowrie shells, and you can call it Soul Brother Beret or Soul Sister Beret. So they would give it names to make it sound really political, but they were taking these everyday pieces. Okay. How production techniques, how we dye our own clothes, how we sew our own clothes, how we design clothes that accentuate the fullness of our body. So if you look at this woman here on the far end, for example, the geographic prints on the fabric are designed to highlight certain parts of her body. So the cutouts here are designed to make her waist look smaller and her hips and her derriere look larger. Is to celebrate those curves, the curves of the body. And this is an art and a textile production technique that is unique to us. Why would we let somebody rob our styles? And so there's really this contested conversation about the place of African fashions when they're not worn on African bodies. And so for me, this was an important part of the dialogue. But again, because this stuff is messy and complicated, it's happening at the same time that this is happening. Where I found this, it's like the first call for an Afro wig on my battery thing that is taking place in Drum Magazine, where they're saying, it's here at last, the Afro wig. Finally, now we can look stylish like the women in the United States and London, right? They want to wear this wig, they want to be on trend. So again, it's like all these things are part of a circuit of cultural and political exchange is taking place across the 1960s and 70s as people start becoming more politically mobilized and having these intra-racial conversations about authenticity, legitimacy, in terms of politics and culture, as the fashion itself is becoming more and more casual, but casual is now in, so now casual is expensive and highly commodified, right? So there's all this stuff, but the language comes out of the political context. So when we get to then a more present day moment, and we start to think about Black Lives Matter, and we go back to this idea that the movement walks around differently, it does in many ways. It does. But it also is up to us to tell more rich and robust stories about movement history. So the movement doesn't look like this compared to this, right? That the movement history can flesh out those pieces of SNCC. It can flesh out some of the dynamics that are happening on campus. We can push back against these ideas that once we get past the mid-1960s, that it's all about a corporate co-optation narrative of the movement or a declension narrative of the movement. That there are these stark distinctions between the early 1960s and the late 1960s. Part of doing that means we need to ask different questions of the archive. We need to think of new ways of storytelling, new ways of getting at this history. And for me, it was, again, assembling that eclectic archive. It was about asking my interlocutors different questions that they told me, oh, I never thought about it. Nobody's even asked me that before, right? But once we do that, then we get a richer history of this, and we can see in many ways how there is a blueprint that doesn't have anything to do with respectability politics, that has been laid out before us, that is really a part of both our political and our style genealogy. And it's part of a global conversation about Black freedom. It wasn't just taking place in the United States, it was happening across the African diaspora. It's really those conversations that I want my book to bring to bear, so that when people of the Black Lives Matter generation go to understand or talk about their history and how they're intervening, because they are intervening in important ways, that they have a story that's not ripped right off of the commercials of McDonald's, but one that's really more fully formed and fleshed out. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
So we're going to open the floor for questions.
So I wanted to ask about the trajectory of influence. Namely that if there's a sort of way in which the movement, if I'm understanding it correctly, of like the wearing of denim and having this kind of militarization and sort of standardization of kind of protest clothing that happened in the 60s and early 70s with the Black Panther Party, if there's a sort of, if you could maybe talk a little bit about how this trajectory of influence works now, where we have things like Tumblr or Pinterest or Instagram, etc. Like, how do you see what kinds of parallels and what kinds of convergence or what kinds of divergences, I guess you could say, are happening in that sense? And so that I don't have a sense of the sort of trajectory of students now. Right. And the way that they take on this sort of appropriation in the same way that it seemed very clear in your talk, the way in which the sort of political and the sort of representation of authenticity moved between the various groups.
Okay, so I think there's a few things that are happening. One is now in this digital space that we're living in, it's allowing us to unearth imagery that we didn't easily have access to before. So part of the reason I'm able to stumble across this picture of Joyce and Dory Ladner is because now someone who was involved in the movement decides to create a digital archive of the Civil Rights Movement era, right, in which these pictures are part of that. So what in part it means to me is that college students today are having access to imagery from an earlier time period that they can think of as influential. So say the sheer fact that someone creates a shirt that's called Asada Taught Me, that means that they are in some way accessing her writings, they're accessing pictures and imagery of this movement. And they're also getting to it not just directly from the folks from this era, but it comes up through a hip-hop generation ethos as well. So there are these different moments in which symbols and imagery like black leather jackets and African printed garments and ankhs and clenched fist t-shirts and Malcolm X t-shirts come up through the 1980s and the 1990s, where we see a resurgence of those things. So part of it is in, I think, the cultural lifeblood of hip-hop. So when somebody like Tess Poe is accessing this language of walking around differently and seeing the t-shirt and the hoodie as being part of that, he's situating himself within a larger history of hip-hop culture in which these things come up through time, right? So if we think about early hip-hop, this is taking place around this time of social movement as well, and people are responding to local conditions related to deindustrialization, gentrification, and so on and so forth. So I think that there is a way that the social media aspect of this makes it easier to access these garments and materials, and then students are now flipping and remixing a lot of these same things. And so to the point where I think I have an image here, where this is from the University of Missouri student protest, right? So students are taking up some of the similar symbols and they're saying, these things resonate as powerful to us. They resonate as black to us. And what I want my work to then do for this generation is to say that the symbols and imagery are great, and I want them to have a history that goes along with how those symbols come to be and why people have historically saw those colors and those symbols as powerful or as a representation of revolutionary Black politics. I think it's an interesting conversation and how it plays out on social media through Tumblr and all those things. You can see the way that people are taking up a lot of these images and posting them on their Tumblr and finding inspiration from them in ways that I don't want to use the language of appropriation to characterize what I'm seeing, but ways that students are reaching back in the same way that my mom's generation did with an earlier generation of folk, like Zora Neale Hurston, for example. I know she was very influential for my mother. People who are, again, slightly older, like Miriam Makeba, Abby Lincoln, who represent a slightly older, these are women who were born in the 1930s, as opposed to my mom who's born in 54. So there's a way they're reaching back to some of that era style and remixing it. So I like to think of it as this soul remixing that keeps being regenerated across time and across space, because it's also traveling around the diaspora, and we can see that happen, particularly when it comes to the resurgence of African prints and African garments, which are now, again, another huge fashion trend and style that marketplaces, online marketplaces like Zuba are making more accessible to folks. So it's an interesting cycle. This, I think, central to the way we think about how diaspora is being made and practiced across the 20th and early 21st centuries. Okay, lots of hands. Okay, let's go here.
Yeah, I was curious, as you started bringing your first point, someone said Sunday's best is
Yes.
what a lot of the classical civil rights imagery or chart that we saw. I was curious because I think up until maybe the mid-1960s, most middle class or lower middle class African Americans, their dress was sort of conditioned by church and work.
Right.
And so what's also happening toward the end of the 60s is that less Black people are going to church, in addition to a whole bunch of other things, right? So I'm curious as to the role of the perhaps decreasing influence of sort of religious wear, or how one's sort of faith practices are informing how they dress, and how that sort of, or if you see at all any, that playing a role in people shifting toward less of the sort of suit and the dress and the Sunday's best, right?
Mm-hmm. So I have no statistics on Black people going to church less by the late 1960s. I can't necessarily speak to that part. But I also want to say, too, that for people regardless of class, that work was informing how they thought about dress as well. Because a lot of what comes up in the stories about SNCC is the fact that some people are critiquing their use of the overall, saying that, like, working class folk, when we come home, we want to take off that uniform, and we want to put on some dressy clothes that signal our laboring body as different than our leisurely or casual body, right? So there's a way that that work is ordering a lot of people's thoughts about how they should dress, what their life looks like when they come home from work, what they put on, what they take off. So I think that that's an important point. So it's not even just an ethos that's coming from the middle class African American community. Is really a conversation about the working or laboring body that's taking place across classes within our community. As for the religious part of it, I think that's an interesting piece, because I do think that just from my anecdotal experiences in Black churches, that over time it's become more acceptable to wear more casual clothing in church, and that part of the way we reach the unsaved masses, right, is by come as you are, right? That becomes the language. I'm not exactly sure if I can pinpoint that historically when that shift starts to happen, but I think what we also see is that, at least with regards to how the movement is presented to us through the print media of the day, as the movement becomes quote unquote more radical, and we think of it as moving outside of the South, which of course there's still radical organizing happening in the South, we think of it as being dislocated from the church. So our focus on the centrality of the church in Sunday best starts to shift when we start seeing movement spaces and where we think movement activism is taking place move outside of the church. Right, so you're very rarely talking it when we start to think about like the Black Panthers. It's not this whole conversation about like, oh, the church mothers, and we had this meeting at the church house, you know. And so I'm wondering how what it would look like then if we looked at the role of churches in Black Power organizing. Then what would the attire look like? If we had snapshots from those images and we use those, what would that conversation look like? I don't know. So I think it's a really good question. It's some work that I think maybe you should take up. That was all I had, yeah.
Yes, at the beginning of your presentation, you mentioned Melissa Harris Perry, and so throughout listening to you discuss, I couldn't help but think of her idea of the crooked room, and the concept of citizenship. And so I'm curious about your thoughts of the identity of style in relation to sister citizen.
All right, so tell people what your reading or understanding of the crooked room is.
Okay, so my understanding of the crooked room is that as a minority woman, the room or citizenship is always crooked, and you always have to adjust yourself, right, to feel like it is looking straight. And so this idea about always adjusting or always assimilating to societal citizenship, so white citizenship, and the privileges that come with that specific type of citizenship, and thinking about how often style can be related to one's identity, as well as one's own citizenship to a particular nation is also part of one's identity. I was particularly curious about how those two can be influenced, as well as your discussion of that displacement of citizenship. So maybe that was just a misguided explanation of the crooked room. I can never do as great as Melissa Harris Perry, but
Well, she did kind of write the book, so
right.
we don't expect you to do it exactly the way that she does. But yeah, I mean, again. So when I talk about this politics of respectability piece, or this language that we use, politics of respectability as a theory that we really get from Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham, who's actually writing about a completely different time period than the 1960s. What we see is that these things, when college women who are part of the movement are really taking great care to fix their hair, to press their hair and curl it nicely and neatly, even though they know they're going to go out and be sprayed with water hoses. That is not about the vanity of a college woman, right? Like there's a way that part of it is part of our grooming, but these are survival strategies that you have to look the part in order to not be killed in many cases, right? That this is how women are trained to think about grooming their bodies. It's not necessarily about a way to be white or to fit into white society per se, but it's about a way to have pride in yourself, but also to protect yourself. When we think about Emmett Till, when he is brutally murdered in Mississippi, one of the things they do to him, this kid who we knew was really invested in dressing nice and dressing sharp, they strip him of his clothes. They tie him to this cotton gin naked, right? Like his clothing is a sign or a marker, extension of his humanity, of the way he's claiming space in an area that says there is no space for you here, right? So these things matter to folk. They have long histories. When Ann Moody writes about attending her first sit-in at a Woolworth's sit-in lunch counter, she writes about how people her own age, other college-age folk, are throwing pies in her face and hitting her with sugar and ketchup, and they drag her out by her hair, you know. But yet and still, what does she do as soon as that happens? She goes to a beauty shop. Not because I need to look cute, girl, before I go back on the campus. It's like I have to rebuild my sense of self, my dignity that someone knows is attached to how I am grooming myself, how I'm caring for myself, how I'm using that as a sign of my humanity. So the women in the beauty shop then embrace her with love, and they move aside the appointments to get her in there to fix her hair. The woman who owns the shop comes over and cleans off her stockings that have mustard. They're stuck to her legs. Like this, so there's a way that I don't want to make this sound trivial even when we talk about a politics of respectability and what that meant for a lot of people. What it meant to push back against these ideas of you being a Jezebel. We can use that language now, like, oh, Jezebel, and all that, but think about what it really meant that people were attaching those labels and those stereotypes to you, and what it means even still today, like for those of us who have to endure that regularly. So I think that's an important piece of the history that I try to write about in the work with care. Because as you said, like, these are real lived experiences for women. And so I don't like to be dismissive of it, even though we know, as the members of SNCC knew then, that respectability will not save you. That will not stop you from getting killed. It doesn't matter, you know. But for a lot of people, they did see it as a political strategy that was necessary in those early movement years. So good question. I think I saw another hand over here.
I was having a conversation before you started speaking with this young lady right here, who's a law student, and it was about the Beyonce's halftime performance. So I was glad to see you had that slide, and I was just wondering, I don't know, you might have something to add to it. What you make of that presentation, the visual presentation that is, you know, reminiscent of the Black Panthers, so much so that there's been a war on social media on both sides,
Right.
with a lot of heat. So I don't know, did you have anything?
I mean, I thought it was interesting because I thought most people who would watch it would just think it was like a Janet Michael reference. And so then when I saw that people who are not tuned into the movement necessarily were making that explicit tie and then like pushing back against it, I thought that was, because I think a lot of what Beyonce does is couch what she does in subtlety, and so this seemed a lot more explicit and more explicit than I even thought she was going for.
What was that anniversary, though? It was the Black Panthers anniversary.
They were in the Bay.
I mean, and there was a lot of things going on. And with her outfit, she did, well, they said that she was paying homage to Michael Jackson. I don't think she was. Okay, she came there specifically. The way she was giving honor to the Black Panther movement, and this country is going crazy because whenever you say anything Black Panther, it's very militant. They're going to kill everybody. That's not how they started.
Right.
And she really was giving homage, I think, to the appreciation for them wanting to protect us. That's how they started. They started in protection of children. And when she did that, I thought it was, I mean, I really am so very proud of her. Me being a woman born, you know, back in the day, and everything that you're speaking of, I'm sitting here and I'm listening because I haven't heard people talk about this for a very long time. The whole fashion of everything. I'm a fashionista. I'm opening up a thrift store on North Avenue on March 15th. But the whole, I had to put that in there. But everything that you're showing, I lived through. I was too young to march, but you couldn't tell me when I was in the 6th grade that I wasn't Angela Davis.
Right.
You know, and I went to a predominantly white school, and they didn't treat us nice. You know, so I did form a protest of all the black kids. We dressed all in black. I wasn't even allowed to wear black. My mother would not let me wear black. I was too young to wear black. So after she went to work, I snuck in her closet, got some black things. When the bell rang, not one black child moved. And this is when I was 12 years old. And all that, the fist there on the screen, I wrote, and who would do this to a child? My 6th grade teacher, we had to write, we had to bring in, what do you call it, your family emblem. Now you know good and damn well we ain't got one. You know, so I did the fist exactly right there. I could draw. So I drew that exact fist that's on that t-shirt. But I put peace leaves going over it. I put the United States flag underneath the fist because this is who I am. I put Africa up in the corner. I never got anything below an A in her class until that day she gave me an F.
Wow.
I had to create it. So, and when I told her, well, I had to create it. We don't have a family seal or none of that stuff. And it's hanging in my mother's bedroom to this day. My parents had to go up there. I mean,
Your parents sound like my mama.
I mean, it was really, really bad, but we got in trouble. I said all that to say, as far as a fashion statement is concerned, you know, the movements have uniforms. Martin Luther King, everybody was in their Sunday best. That was their uniform. You know, the Black Panthers with the berets and the black leather, that was a uniform. Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam, all suited down looking like soldiers, that was a uniform. We also were not allowed, up until I was in the 7th grade, we couldn't wear pants to school. There was dress codes everywhere. You had to wear skirts, you know, you couldn't wear pants. And I think that when the young ladies with the overalls and coming out that way, that's also a break of freedom.
Yeah, it really is. And so I love hearing you make all these connections, and it really ties into the Beyonce piece as well. I mean, what I think is interesting is, I don't know if you all remember this moment, it just happened a few months before this, where everybody's favorite TV show, Empire, had that scene where they had, you're like, no, right? Well, they had that scene where the song Power, and they had on black leather, they had berets, and,
Right, that's true.
no one really, that was like a splash in the pan moment, right? But Beyonce does this at the Super Bowl, and this is a conversation that will not die. Like, this is like a major cultural moment that I think we are going to be writing about. It's going to go down in history. We're going to be writing about this Beyonce moment and what it meant for them to wear the attire of Black Panthers, or something that, some, you know, performative aspect of that, right? And I think that I think the beauty of culture is that it's open to many different interpretations, right? We don't have to all walk away from this moment and see it and read it in the same way. Depending on a lot of different factors and variables, you may understand it as a show of, oh, you're just, you know, a capitalist Beyonce, or you might read it as, you know, you're seeing yourself as part of this lineage of Black activists. It's a way for you to claim Black beauty, and you love yourself, and you love your features, and all this other thing. There's a variety of ways that this moment could be read. But what is interesting for me is how we just had a similar moment and no one was really talking about it beyond that. In fact, people were saying it was like too dead on. Like, that's cheesy. You gonna wear like a beret, like that's so, why is that so spot on, you know? But in this, people are like, oh wow, like this is really something that's innovative, it's engaging. It's in part the power of the machine that is Beyonce, the way that I do think she is forcing us to have some conversations, whether no matter what side we fall on, about this history, about the movement, about Black lives, about these things, about capitalism, about all these things. And I think that there is a space for us to have critical dialogue about these issues if we want to. Because the reality of it is that, going back to your question, this is a lot of the ways that young folks end up learning moments in history. Like, I know for me, when I was coming of age in the 90s, my favorite rapper was Yo-Yo.
Yeah.
I just thought, you know, I just thought, oh, she's so conscious, and, you know, she had light eyes like me, and finally there was a girl who kind of looked like me, and I was like, oh yeah, like, oh, Yo-Yo, she's so dope, and oh, she's like this Black feminist, and she's like, she has the YBW, the Young Black Women Coalition, and they were like these, you know, Black feminists, and, you know, she was telling me all this history and stuff that I did not know, to the point where I went to my other friends in middle school, I was maybe around 6th grade at that time. And she's like, I'm like, yo, we need to call ourselves the YBW, and our colors need to be red and green and yellow. And so we had our hoodies and the colors, and we were like a dance team. We had our little routines. We danced off yo-yo, and I'm like, yeah, you know, Black Power fist and all this stuff. So there's a way that was happening in my home, but Yo-Yo made it real for me in a way that was different than how my mom was articulating that stuff, right? So it was a way she was teaching it to me through a hip hop ethics, right? Through a hip hop lens that to me somehow made sense, you know, and that became part of my cultural reality alongside cross colors, alongside Karl Kani, alongside all these other things. There was Yo-Yo and this kind of Black feminist politic that she was representing. And I think a lot of young people are experiencing similar things today, and even though their political consciousness or their feminist consciousness might not be fully formed right now, you just don't know what those seeds might do or what it might lead you to then go on and study, or movements you might go on to lead in the future. We don't know. And so that's my point here, that a lot of this stuff is happening outside of the realm of formal politics. You weren't even going to marches, but you were still finding a way to bring that movement politic to the space that you could inhabit as a young person.
You know, you bring up the point about empire. The thing we forget, well, it's two things. People have been borrowing Black Power, Black Panther icons and imagery for a long, long time.
Exactly.
Nobody ever did it at halftime of the most watched TV.
That's true.
And that's been a large reason why we're having the conversation over Beyonce, because of when she did it.
Right. Even though we were having the conversation like the day before when she released the video, it wasn't released to the Black Panthers, but she had already, it was a carefully crafted release of things, right? That built up to
It was genius. It was genius. She's a more than genius. She's
We weren't
genius.
thinking of, Rush Limbaugh was not talking about what was on Empire.
right.
That's
Rush
what
Limbaugh's gonna be watching the Super Bowl just like Susie and her husband Six Pack Joe, or Joe Six Pack or whatever it is, you know. And so like Beyonce releases a video at 2:47 a.m. and the Beehive knows, and then everybody else knows, and by 6 o'clock she's late. But you know, the mainstream is still not going to necessarily be aware of that, even though Beyonce is one of the most recognizable icons in the world, right? So we have to think about that audience and who's watching. I haven't seen Empire sometime, right? But like there are a lot of people who are, that Empire is just not their, like they may hear some stuff about it, they may see it mentioned on a word show or whatever, but they're not checking for who's money. And so, you know, but the Super Bowl, that you're watching the Super Bowl if you don't watch football any other time of the year for the most part. And so that it was kind of encompassing that moment for us in a different way for her purposes, you know.
Right, and so I think it's interesting too, because so what I'm trying to say here is that it's not just every time the symbols are evoked, right? That there are the time, space, that certain things matter, because there's a way that depending who does it, it can make a larger splash. Who does it and where they do it, you know? Go ahead.
Speaking of global pop superstars, I wanted to pivot off Beyonce for just a second.
Oh, nice.
Well, I know we're going to come back to it. I was, you know, in looking at the slides you were showing, I was thinking about, and you had mentioned that in your book research you looked at album covers. I wonder if you ever came across a picture of Bob Marley before he locked out all the way completely. He looked like he was over here off Cottage Grove. And all of the waves did very urban environment in Jamaica in the late 60s and early 70s. It was almost an urban language, a global urban language that time, that everybody took those cues from what was happening in the streets of America. Did you see that in your research?
Yeah, I mean, not specifically focused on Bob Marley, but yes, most certainly. But what I try to push back against is that is a very U.S.-centered story of this, that it's only happening in the U.S., or people are only looking to the U.S., because it's happening in both directions. So part of the way I do that in the book is that I start in South Africa with Miriam Makeba, the singer. And I look at how she's performing with a group that's called the Manhattan Brothers. Right? Think about that as a name. And they're wearing these expensive imported Florsheim shoes, and she's dressing in like sheath dresses, and you know, these things that a lot of people would associate with like Western fashion. But at the same time, over here in the U.S., Ebony Magazine is running whole issues on Sekou Touré coming to the United States, and oh, this is what his wife was buying when she went shopping at this store. And look at what the diplomats are wearing in Ghana, and look, there's this highlight dance that they're doing. This is the sign of freedom. So it's like we're looking there to borrow from them. They're looking here, borrowing from us. I also studied London, which is situated kind of in the middle, and they're looking here, there, and to the Caribbean, you know. So there's a way that all these styles are being mixed. When Mary McCabe marries Stokely Carmichael, right, they become the embodiment of soul power, right? And so then one of the things that they say they're going to do is then open up a shop, a boutique in the Bahamas. And they're going to have West Indian seamstresses create those styles there, and then they're going to ship them to other parts of the diaspora. Until the U.S. government contacts the Bahamian government and says, you have public enemy number 1 on your shores, either kick them out of your country or else, right? And so then they shut down this whole idea of the boutique. But my point here is all this is mixed. A South African woman who's married to a man who's of West Indian ancestry, who is going to open up a shop there, who's moving across the diaspora, who settles in West Africa for a long period of time. Like, there's a way that all these styles are borrowing and riffing off of one another.
Just like that Essence cover that you showed, with the woman in cornrows.
Right, exactly. And two, what's happening, so we have other celebrity women who become markers of this style too. So Cicely Tyson, Mary McCabe herself with her Pata Pata album. By that time she has grown out her short, close cropped hairstyle, and she's rocking cornrows with the wooden beads. And so these women become style icons. Interestingly enough, you see them sometimes on the pages of Essence, but very rarely in Ebony, even though Ebony starts to write stories in the mid-1960s and 70s talking about, is brown now beautiful? Like, is natural hair in? You know, like they're asking us in the mid-60s, but really the magazine, if you want to see Mary McCabe, if you want to see Stokely, Nina Simone, you want stories on the Black Panthers, a lot of those stories are being written in Sepia magazine, which doesn't survive. But it's really a rich primary source that taps into all these diasporic flows related to politics and dress and music. So for me, it was a very useful source as I was writing the book. So a hand here.
So somebody mentioned cornrows was kind of like set off a light in my brain. I'm curious what you think about like a lot of these styles that you're talking about now, particularly hairstyles. We talked about appropriation, you know, in the 70s with like shinkies and things like that. But how you see those, that sort of same trend, I would say, even with women, Black women's hairstyles being appropriated by non-Black women.
Like give an example of a hairstyle.
Cornrows, baby hair,
Baby
white women flipping down their real hair.
The mini buns, is that what they call Bantu buns?
I've even seen white girls with braid extensions, box braids. Also, I've even seen a video of a white woman trying to do her hair as an afro.
Oh, yeah.
So just that sort of.
Yeah.
I was just saying, they'll like use it, but then rename it.
Yeah.
And what I just saw was like, it was some sort of method, it was just a two-strand twist, but they called it something completely different. They called it the rope method. I don't understand. And I was like, does that come back to just, you can't really adopt as something casually when other people are generally getting kicked out of school and being denied jobs and stuff because of those styles?
Right. I mean, it's one of the things that, you know, Black women, our response often is everything but the burden, right? You know, like you want the trend, you want the style, you want the look, but the life that comes along with that, you often don't want. And I think it's interesting that you brought up the hard-fought battles that are happening in the workplace. Because my mom is part of that first generation of women who would have come of age in this era, who then are entering into corporate America and other forms of the professional world, and having to bring lawsuits against their employers for not allowing them to wear their cornrows or their locks or their natural afros and so on and so forth. So it really is an important history to trace there. But that the conversation about appropriation, man, it's just one that just, since the beginning of time, that's been the case. You know, even when we think about Victorian dress and the big bustles that, you know, women are wearing on their dress and how they're using that as a way to emulate the fuller backsides of black women. So that appropriation piece, it always seems to be there and part of the narrative in ways that is often contentious and problematic. But less attention is paid too also to this conversation that's happening within the black community about cultural appropriation or who's more authentic with their print. So if you have a print that's not a real wax print, or when you turn it over, it's like that faded color, like it's only printed on one side, like, or who could tie their wrap more authentically. And we see those conversations happening again too. Remember recently with that story about African Americans, stop appropriating African culture, stop wearing your head wrap, stop wearing the tribal paint, stop wearing septum rings. It's an interesting and fraught conversation. I think that I don't know, like what would you like to see? What would you want to see happen with this cultural appropriation? Would you want people to just stop doing it? Would you want to see recognize that you're stealing our stuff, or like what is it that
That, I know.
you said yes, right? Yes.
Recognize.
Number 2, please.
Recognize where it's coming from, and also don't, tell me that I'm not fitting in with company culture if I wear a head wrap, or if I wear an afro, or if my hair is not twisted or braided a certain way that you find